All right, welcome back. You caught me. I was in the middle of making a gift to the Arboretum. Uh, we are excited by this day of giving. What the response has been. I'm here with Greg Paige, Director of Horticulture. This has been a fun day. Starting 10 o'clock this morning, and we've still got an hour to go, and we're trying to fill it with good information for you. We started off talking about some of our this morning, talking about some of our brand new introductions. We've talked about some native trees and plants along the way. And we're finishing up with what do you do under those trees, right?
We get asked that probably the most.
Yeah. What can grow under my tree? Well, second most. What won't deer eat? And what can I grow under my trees? We've got a little of both of that here, actually. So we're good. So we'll talk about some of these plants you can grow in dry shade. That's the key, is dry shade with these plants. And then we'll talk a little bit about really gardening under the trees in a broader sense. So this is really my love is gardening in the shade. I finally got a house with sun, and all I do is go in the shade and keep planting things. My wife keeps saying, why do I see you clearing more space in the woods? What are you doing? I'm like, no, it's okay. It's okay. I'm just letting a little more light in. That's all. We'll talk about a few things. We talked about a little bit earlier today when we talked about plants you can't kill. And I try not to duplicate too many, but this guy just looks so good in the nursery that I couldn't pass it up. This is a Rhodia. This is one called Taiyoden, not Toyota, but Taiyoden. Really distinctive one. When you look at all of ours on tables in our greenhouse, sometimes it's hard to tell them apart, but this one has a really nice, broad, creamy margin. And Rhodias are great for growing in the shade. Y'all, the real entertainment is taking place off the street.
It really is.
A little breeze
it's
going.
Great.
We're not getting punchy after this many hours.
Not at all.
But in the garden, these Rhodia, these sacred lilies, just are easy performers. You plant them. If it's really dry and really miserable, they just grow slower. If they're really happy, they'll offset, and you'll get bigger clumps of them. Little spikes of fairly inconspicuous flowers, followed by bright red fruits, which are really nice. All kinds of different forms of these, but even just the plain green ones are awesome. I plant them out in big sweeps. The deer don't eat them, so that's nice. But just easy, low care plants. Do you grow any Rhodias?
I don't. One I do grow.
Ophiopogon.
Brain dead. Ophiopogons.
That's one that it went through the nursery. It went through the industry misnamed as Chingiai, which you probably saw in Vietnam when you were there.
Yes.
One of the ones on an Ophiopogon on a stick.
Yes.
This is true. It is umbraticola is what that one is.
But this genus of plant, there's not a single one that I don't like. I like all the Ophiopogon. And when I was younger, I always wanted a lawn of just Ophiopogon. I thought that would have been a really cool thing to do.
You know what I was going to do? Checkerboard. Blue fescue.
That would be cool too.
And Ophiopogon, mondo grass.
Coming to an arboretum near you. that would be awesome. But a great dry shade plant. Again, one of those things that any size and stature that you want. Some of them, you kind of miss this attribute about them. The fruit, it can be really attractive. Have really bright, pearly blue colors, the color of the sky to dark blue. But I'd like that really, really dense foliage. And I like this one because it's kind of contorted, but I like the ones that are a little bit taller. There's a bunch of them out there. Tony carries a bunch of them at his nursery. Our colleague at Atlanta Botanic Garden, they grow a bazillion of them down there too. That's really where I fell in love with them. But it's a great, great dry shade plant. This is something that looks better in kind of a mass, small or bigger, but they definitely do not disappoint.
Yeah, I agree. I love this one especially. That real congested, almost like a Brillo pad, and it's like wiry. And I've been having some problems in my dry shade garden with a plant that I always told people, plant that in the woodlands, deer won't touch it. Well, that's true. But some of my carex, the sedges,
Yeah.
deer aren't eating them, but rabbits are eating. I could not figure out why until perhaps it was Tim or maybe you pointed out that the rabbits are probably using it to line their burrows. Yeah. And that's exactly what it is. It's driving me crazy because the deer eat everything else, and now the rabbits are eating my sedges, but they haven't touched my Ophiopogons at all. And there really are some cool ones. And there are a mystery right now. There are so many species that are just being discovered and written up or just getting into cultivation now that it can be difficult. There's one I think it comes from this, but it's not pure umbraticola, called Sparkler. That's the
one with the pretty fruit.
Yeah, and it's the fruit on all of them, but you're right, you got to dig in there for fruit. I've got one of these that's just this beautiful little mound. Another group of plants that I always want to grow, but most we can't. And those are primroses, the Primula. And this is just past flowering. It was in a nursery, so it's just finished up. This one is Miho-no-koji. Despite looking kind of blue-purple with these dried flowers, it's a pink flowered one. Actually, this is getting ready to open, so it's going to be a little bit more of a flower. But this is a Primula sieboldii type. The sieboldii are not like those high alpine primroses or the ones that grow in cool areas and damp soils. These Japanese ones, the sieboldii and Kisoena, which have more rounded scalloped leaves, are great for us in shade. And I've been surprised at how well they've done in dry shade in my garden.
What's the one that's planted near the winter garden? We walked by it the other day.
Now that's an unusual one called Dale Henderson, which is a vulgaris type that should not grow here, but is amazing. Came from an old friend of mine, Dale Henderson in Virginia Beach. Although I got it from the West Coast, from Dan Hinckley, who got it from Dale Henderson. And after I'd gotten it, I got to know Dale Henderson. And I will say, for those of you who are giving today, Dale Henderson and her husband, they left when Dale passed away, created an endowment for interns. So we have an internship endowment, the Dale and Tom Henderson internship endowment, which, so since we're talking Day of Giving,
that's a good,
you brought that up.
Serendipitous.
We scripted that.
Yes, we talked about that. Talked about it.
But where many of these primroses stay as one little clump, the Primula sieboldii spread and will make nice patches. Now, I'm going to be going off on tangents after this long of a day, but if you're watching the new miniseries, Shogun,
it's pretty good.
It is. It's really good. Siebold was kind of not quite that early, but pretty early on in Japan. He wasn't allowed to go out and look for plants everywhere. And so some of these things that are named for him, like Primula sieboldii, they were getting hay and stuff cut from the fields to feed the horses on this little island that they were sequestered on. And so they would pull it apart, the botanist, or doctor really at the time, he was Dr. Siebold, he was the physician, but would pull it apart and look at the plants and kind of describe them from that. So anything with the name Siebold on there, probably came from Japan. So Primula sieboldii, and there are a bunch of these. I grow some. There's one called Dainty Lady, I think, that's white with pink tips and real frilly. We grow several of these in the laugh house, and they just make bigger and bigger clumps and kind of spread. And I love these things. Early spring, and then they'll go kind of summer dormant, but they pop up in the spring and flower, and they're tough plants. Those plants that disappear early sometimes are worried that they're gone for good. All right, what else should we talk about? Aspidistras. You don't call these things cast iron plants for nothing.
Yeah.
Right here where we're filming, we're under a couple live oaks, and we have big patches of Aspidistra here as well. And thanks to our good friend Tony Avon at Juniper Level Botanic Garden Plant Delights Nursery, who grows probably more of these than anybody else, we have quite a good collection. And these are great house plants. This is another one I learned as a house plant, cast iron plant, because you can put it in a pot in a bar and it'll live, cigarette butts in there. Well, that's when I learned it in college. You could put it in the bar and have cigarette butts in there. I don't guess you can have cigarette butts in it anymore. You know, people pour the dregs their beer in there. No problem. The plant just keeps living. In that situation, it'll have one leaf and just always have that one leaf. But if it's happy, it'll bulk up. And I like it in pots. It's actually the only house plant I have in my house is a subtropical Aspidistra, but I have it because I can forget about it for months at a time and then go stick it in the sink, pour some water in it, rehydrate it, and it's fine. It's almost like having plastic plants, but they're actually not plastic.
Tough love.
Tough love. Ferns, you into ferns?
I am. But again, I'm a bit out of my depth here. The Pyrrosias I like a lot. Sword fern, common name?
Fern, tongue fern.
Tongue fern is what I've learned them by. But again, a nice coarse texture. That new growth is very tomentose.
Yeah, this thing's, I mean, you just want to pet that thing. And this is one that we have as Pyrrosia. It may be something related. Lepisorus. We got to wait until the spores show up on the back and really get sense. But you're like me. I love ferns. I know nothing about ferns.
Propagating them is an absolute mystery to me. It seems like smoke and mirrors. Like it's the gentleman that does the workshop for us dropped a lot of knowledge on me about them. It's absolutely fascinating how they're propagated, but again, completely out of my depth with ferns.
So, and this is another one. You're like me, though. I don't know about ferns, so I gravitate towards these ones with the non-ferny ferns, the ones with the entire leaves.
Yep.
But I find that, so most of these, the Pyrrosias, and this is Lepisorus Bicolor, I believe. Yeah, Bicolor. These grow as epiphytes on trees or lithophytes on stones. And so they're incredibly drought tolerant. We do have one native one, the resurrection fern that you see growing in live oaks down south and the coast that shrivel up to nothing. And then it rains and they look beautiful again. And then they shrivel up to nothing and then look beautiful again. So I love these things for dry shade. They actually, if they're in too moist soil, too rich a soil, and they're growing flat, they die. But if you put them on a slope or put them on dry soil, they do great. And what I do is I like to grow them on a little bit of slope, and I'll have a stone there, maybe on the edge of a path, something like that. And I will plant them right up against there. And they seem to really like that. And I've actually got some, this Lepisorus is a pretty quick spreader for one of these plants. And you can kind of see
lots of new shoots coming up.
New shoots in this pot. You can kind of see how it's all in a row, and it'll keep kind of growing in a row. But I've actually got these starting to grow up on onto the rocks and things like that. And so the most common tongue fern, Pyrrosia lingua, is one that I grow that in a container. I have some in a container, big, shallow, wide container. Don't water it. It stays outside year round. It's perfectly hardy. And that I'm growing that like that. I'm gonna pull it out of that pot. You're gonna like this. This was the tree. I've got a weeping Japanese maple, Raulston. It's in a pot that's weeping down too far. Putting it in a big hanging basket. But before I put it in there, on the bottom of the basket, I'm going to put that Pyrrosia in there on the bottom of it.
Like that.
Plant the Japanese maple on top, fill it in. So I'm going to have like the bottom of the basket's going to be all this tongue fern, and then there's going to be Japanese maple on top.
It looks like something that was around with dinosaurs.
Yeah, exactly.
It's got that Jurassic look about them.
I love it. Love it. Talked about one of these earlier. If you caught us at the very beginning of the day, the first plant I talked about was an introduction of Ardisia japonica. Now, this is not that Ardisia. This is a really small leaf one. And this is interesting. This is the small leaf one, small grown one I've always known is one called Chiramin. And Chiramin is one of the best ones for us. It grows, it's most cold hardy. It forms nice little patches, only about 2 or 3 inches tall, little pink flowers, little red fruits that kind of hide out under the foliage. But this is a different one. It's got a longer, narrower leaf than Chiramin. It is growing side by side. It is distinctly different. This is one I got from a friend on the West Coast who got this just as Ardisia japonica narrow leaf from JC way back years and years ago. And he said, "Do you want a piece?" because of course I was walking around his garden. I was like, "Ooh, what's that?" And I said, "Yes, of course I want to, please. Yes, please." And
Yes,
so
please.
it's been really vigorous. It's really nice. It's tough. The Ardisias, again, I never had problem with deer or rabbits. And I didn't mean for this. I didn't do this on purpose, but you get these plants for dry shade that are tough as nails. And guess what? They're
Most
the
of
kinds
them.
that deer tend to stay away from.
Most of them are.
Finish up with these plants on the table with this one. Talked about a polygonatum earlier. This is not polygonatum, but it looks a lot like one. This is Disporopsis. So this is an evergreen Solomon seal. We grow a lot of Disporum, which are deciduous, and this Disporopsis is evergreen. And this is one that is known as lily pads, but nobody knows what species it is. It's an undescribed species. Typically has real thick textured leaves. This one spent most of its life in the greenhouse, actually pretty freshly potted up, but from other plants. So it gets a thicker leaf. And it's interesting, we got a plant that we had wild collected that somebody pointed out to us was not what we had it labeled as, which we love when people come in and tell us we're wrong, because we've got 8,000 plants. It's pretty hard for us to
it's going to happen.
Verify every single one of them. But it looks like it's this same species, but it's a new collection of it. So that gives us a chance to look at some of the variation in the species. But it'll come up with new shoots, little white flowers followed by little black berries. I have one Disporopsis in my garden that the deer eat to here. Every single one of them. They don't touch any other ones in my garden. They never touch this one. It's just that one that they do for me. And it's the straight species of Disporopsis pernii. And I don't know why, but every other form, even of that same species, they leave alone. So we're surrounded by some other plants. I'm not going to have our cameraman try to zoom around to everything, but we have some great hellebores that are great for dry shade. And when we talk about hellebores, I really like to encourage people, get the newer varieties. And I don't say that about a lot of plants, but the old just Hellebores hybridus will seed around in the garden, and they really can become garden thugs over time. They really can. So some of the new hybrids like Anna's red, Penny's pink, and a lot of those are sterile. So the flowers look good even longer, and they don't seed around. And I know a lot of new gardeners say, "Oh no, but I want it to seed all over. I want them to spread."
That changes really quick once you have them.
We've got a plant that you don't think of as a ground cover. It may be hard to see. See if I can grab a piece there. This is cypress. This is like the papyrus that you see in Egypt that they make paper out of. This is a dwarf form of that plant called umbrella grass. This is the Cypress albostriatus, which was named because some of the original ones had variegation in there. But Nana, it's a dwarf one. In the sun, it'll grow to about 8 or 10 inches tall. In the shade where we have it, it really stays about 4 inches tall. Makes a phenomenal ground cover in dry shade. Great. We used to have this growing under. We may still have it growing under a big old oak that predated me, and this patch probably predated me of it. In fact, the patch we have over here probably is divisions from that. It'll grow in water as well as a bog plant, but it'll grow in super dry shade. So it's a good plant for like a rain garden where it dries out and gets moist. But so there are the true papyrus is a much taller plant, needs to grow in water, is pretty tender, won't survive our winters generally. But this albostriatus nana will, and it's a plant that we just kind of forget that it's there. Yeah. It's so reliable.
This is such a good example of exactly what we're trying to drive home is things that you can do under dry shade, and all the different textures and the sweeps of things to kind of get that relevance of what you're looking at.
Yeah, and we could have done a lot more color in here. This was intentional to have this be, when you walk in the garden, you see the big gates behind us. When you walk in the garden, this is to immediately take your blood pressure and drop it by, I don't know how much you drop blood pressure and still be safe. But it really is to just give you a sense that's different from outside on the street to bring it down, and kind of inspired by Roberto Burle Marx, the great Brazilian landscape designer, who was JC's one of his big fans. Other things we have in here: cyclamen, so good under trees. Some ferns,
heucheras, lots of different ferns, acerums.
And one thing with heucheras, sometimes people struggle with them. If you get the right types, the southern types, they're really good. Look for ones like sweet tea and things like that. Those are really good. But another thing that helps them here specifically is there's a real difference between growing these under maples with maple leaves that fall and growing these under oaks like these live oaks. The foliage is completely different.
Yeah.
That maple mats and can rot your plants out, especially heucheras. They hate that.
And there's a little bit of pH stuff that goes on too. But let's talk a little bit about bed prep.
Yeah.
That's something I have a little more knowledge and grasp on. So you see the live oaks behind us. These are special trees to us. And if you have a big tree in your yard and you've got that blank canvas underneath it, there's things you should and shouldn't do to get plants to live and thrive there. The worst thing you can do is you want to fluff the soil up so it's easy to plant. So you get your Troy built out and you go underneath that tree and you go back and forth and you loosen that soil up really, really well. That's the worst thing that you can do. Most of the roots that help feed this tree are in the top 4 to 8 inches of the soil, all the way out well past the drip line of the tree. So in essence, when you do that, you're cutting up all that root system, and the tree is going to have to regenerate that. So that's going to cause a lot of stress. Most people are out in the garden as it gets warmer. That's when the tree needs those roots to push out new leaves, to photosynthesize, do all those things. And you've just set that tree back many possible lifetimes. So it's bad to do that. A lot of these things that we have here don't need a lot of coaxing to get into the soil. If you really want to get fancy, something like an air spade that loosens up the soil without damaging the roots, that's not something that's commercially available. Landscape companies can do that. Tree care companies can do that. But it's the best case scenario. Just using hand tools is probably the best method. Loosening up with hori-horis or spades or things like that. Incorporate a little bit of compost, but the tree is doing that for itself every year by dropping this nice organic layer down. And all the things that we talked about, all the things you see here are things that are going to form big masses so that you're not going to have to worry about replacing mulch or things like that. So that's the nickel version of the most important part of maintaining and not damaging the trees that you want to keep. I can't tell you how many times people have asked us, what's the best way to do that? And don't get out the tiller. That's the worst thing that you could do.
And you don't want to pile a bunch of soil up on the.
No, that's a good point.
But you can do some compost on top of it. Just don't go real deep. And you can add a little bit of compost every year.
Yep.
And it helps build the soil. Like Greg said, leave the leaves in place.
It's free mulch. It's free organic matter. If you are adding soil, keep it away from the root flare of the tree. You don't want to pile anything up around that area. It's very sensitive to that disturbance. But
don't make it into a big bowl.
Right. You don't want it to.
Water goes to it.
Exactly.
But those feeder roots are all out under here. What I love to do is I'll take some of these really tough dry shade perennials and shrubs for that matter, and I'll go up right next to the tree where the root flare is, and if you can't see the root flare, your tree's too deep anyway. So clear around that, and I'll plant right in between two root flares. No, there's not feeder roots much there. Those are structural roots, but I do it with. And people give us a hard time a lot of times about the small plants we have. But when you plant a tree, a shrub, a perennial in a pot like this, it will establish so much quicker and easier than if you have a great big 3-gallon plant. I know we all want that instant look, and people feel like it's going to survive better if it's bigger, but it really won't. Now I have planted something small like this, and the deer have come and tasted it and pulled it out of the ground, but I just go back in there and put it back in the ground. And quite honestly, if you're in my garden, then I step on it a little bit to make sure it's got good contact. But those little plants, you're not disturbing a lot of roots. They're not in as much competition, and they can kind of settle in without being really stressed like you would with a larger container. And you're also not out there, in my garden with a mattock if you're trying to get in the woodlands. You do this smaller area.
And that root system is younger. It hasn't been stepped up and been girdled as it's in smaller to a bigger pot. So smaller is better in some cases.
Yeah. And I'm nothing wrong with planting larger plants.
No.
Just they need more aftercare. They need, strangely as this may sound to a lot of people, they need more water after they've been put in.
Yep.
They're not, that top of that plant is really using a lot of water. When you look at a shrub or a big plant in a 3-gallon pot, there's less top to root in the small pot than there is in something bigger. And so it's got a lot more leaves. It's transpiring a lot more. And remember, it's planted in pine bark, which dries out very quickly in your soil. So you really have to work on that.